Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar with Dr. Mirae Kim on keeping your organization on the right side of financial governance. We're going to wait for just 2 minutes, allow folks to call in, and then we will be sure to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Keeping Your Organization on the Right Side of Financial Governance, hosted by Independent Sector for our members. I'm Allison Grayson, and I'm the Director of Policy Development and Analysis at Independent Sector. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge that Independent Sector is based in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people who are still in the area and working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings we inhabit in the Washington, D.C. area are built with labor of enslaved people. Now, I'd like to turn to the purpose of today's webinar. Today, we're going to talk about how research can teach us about trends around nonprofit financial accountability that can help individual organizations and those organizations that look to support other nonprofits make decisions about governance and financial management. Today's session will be broken up into 2 sections, and each section will be followed by a Q&A portion. So you will have multiple opportunities to ask questions throughout the portion of the program. During the presentation, feel free to provide your thoughts or submit a question into the chat, but please keep your microphones on mute until we reach the engagement portion of the session. Closed captioning will be enabled during today's event. So today's event highlights the value of Independent Sector's Visiting Scholars Program. This program has been in effect for about 4 years, and the goal is to deeply engage a nonprofit research expert to help nonprofit practitioners and policymakers better understand the sector and address issues that will help the sector advance its work. Our visiting scholar for this year is Dr. Mirae Kim, Associate Professor of Nonprofit Studies at George Mason University. Dr. Kim serves as the editor of Nonprofit Policy Forum, co-editor of the Nonprofit Policy Forum, and is a part of a team that builds the National Survey of Nonprofit Trends, and is the manager of the Nonprofit Organization Research Panel Project. Her areas of interest include, but are not limited to, nonprofit financial management, which we're going to talk about today, the role of nonprofits in civil society, cultural policy, interorganizational relationships, and immigrant and BIPOC nonprofit organizations. In addition to all these topics, Dr. Kim is also working with Independent Sector to study nonprofit advocacy. Thank you for joining us today, Mirae. We can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Thanks, Alison, for a very nice introduction. So for those of you who might want to read a little bit more about my research or some background, here's the address to my own website, and it should also show the contact information. So please feel free to contact me for anything. So I'm going to start by saying something very obvious, that is, unlike business that appeal to investors, creditors for capital, we nonprofit organizations primarily depend on charitable giving and grants. So that's part of why Independent Sector has been producing the trust report, because keeping the trust, building the trust within the sector is very important. And I want to encourage you to look at this wonderful report if you haven't. Research had continuously shown empirical evidence over and over that maintaining trust is key to nonprofit existence, and trust is an important factor to build any nonprofit brand. So throughout my slides, which will be shared after the webinar, I put link to the source of each study that I mentioned or I cite in the slide. So if you want to read more details about any of these studies, please feel free to. So during today's webinar, I'm going to cover two topics related to building the sector trust. The second topic is about dispelling overhead myths. And you might think that this is some topic that the sector has already talked enough about, but I'm going to explain why it should be the main part of trust building efforts when we get to that point later today. The first topic that I'm covering today is how to prevent fraud, which is the obvious first ground activity to keep the sector trustful. Again, it might be already intuitive, but there have been series of empirical studies that show the frauds and other negative publicity break trust, and that ultimately result in decline donor support. On average, 1 out of 4 nonprofits close their door after having frauds, whereas the average death rate for normal regular nonprofit is about 5%. And the median loss related to fraud for nonprofit is $60,000 per occurrence, and that's just the median value. But it's not just the financial resources that deplete, but it also damages individual nonprofits' reputation, and also it damages the whole sector's reputation. So the one idea that I want to introduce here is the fraud diamond theory that explains the condition that create fraud cases. The first element is incentive or motivation to commit fraud, such as pressure to meet certain revenue goals or budget goals, or employees having personal financial issues because of luxurious lifestyle that seem to go way beyond pay levels, or gambling or addicts, any other personal issues. The second element is opportunity to commit fraud. For instance, absence or lack of sufficient internal control that happens a lot in a short-staffed organization where only one employee handles our finance from the beginning to end. In a case where just one employee selects vendors, receives our bills, and issues our checks, it creates opportunity to make a fictional vendor to issue a check to the employee's home address. And this is a common scheme found in many nonprofit fraud cases. The third is rationalization, that refers to the attitude where an individual rationalizes himself or herself, thinking that the organization is making enough so he can take some money for his personal interest. Or more common case in the nonprofit sector is one saying, oh, I work so many hours, but I'm not getting enough compensation. Therefore, I need to give myself a little bit of bonus without having anyone to really know. And this happens a lot in many organizations that are short-staffed and undercompensated. And these 3 elements were the original fraud triangle theory, and the authors listed at the bottom of the slide, Orff and Hermansen recently added the 4th element, saying that requires the fraud requires the 4th element, the human capability that understand the corporate governance, economic institutional structures. So what does this idea say for us? So for nonprofit leaders, the most important thing is to recognize the presence of risk factors and using those risk factors to create oversight responsibility to prevent fraud opportunity. And why that is the case, that's because the rule 10-80-10 says the majority of people, the 80% of people will commit fraud only if there's the right combination of the condition that include the pressure, opportunity, and the condition to rationalize the situation. The rest are split between those who never commit fraud, no matter what, and then those who actively make the opportunity for themselves. But the most of the cases can be prevented with the right control system. And in the nonprofit sector, there's always shortage of workforce, and there's also the underlying belief that the people who choose to work in the nonprofit sector are well intended. So there's a greater trust for people. And while that's true, we also agree that many nonprofits work under pressure without enough compensation. So those conditions create room for fraud at the absence of strong internal controls. The latest report on occupational fraud supports that the nonprofits, as compared to other sectors, are particularly vulnerable to fraud because they have fewer internal controls, because they have limited workforce and resources. So they start with a fewer control system to begin with. So it's worth pointing out that nonprofits found with fraud cases were much, much less likely to have any surprise audits happen or have had a formal risk assessment compared to others without. We can always learn from failure, and that's what one of the latest research did. So the study here that came out just 2 months ago show the common structural features that are shared by organizations that had the nonprofit that had misconduct, including but not limited to fraud. But what is all about? So the finding of the study, what it gives us is what are the must-have internal control systems. And I'm not going to bore you with how the study was done, what kind of data they did, but I'm just going to share the big picture main finding. But if you want to read more details about what they did with this study, then again, I share the source of the study in the slide. So these are what they found. Those scandal-free nonprofits, as compared to otherwise very similar nonprofits with some financial scandals or fraud. The scandal-free ones, they commonly have independent board. They have obtained independently audited financial statements. They have the governing board who regularly review the 990 form. They already have established a due process to determine CEO compensation. And these organizations make their Form 990 available on their website. Again, there are more details that you might find interesting if you want to read the whole study. So for the sake of time, I decided not to cover the whole details of elements for good internal control system, but I have some slides prepared to go over the key elements for good internal system. So we can cover that during the discussion session or the time allows. But for now, here's a quick checklist for any organization who wanna review your current status if you're covering all the basics. But I want to emphasize that while you cannot directly safeguard against an employee's need and rational, but internal control system can minimize those opportunities for fraud. So it can minimize the major elements in the fraud diamond. And I want to also point out that according to the occupational fraud report, that the average time the fraud goes undetected is 24 months when there's absence of proper internal control system. But according to the same research, when there was a strong internal control system in place, the average length of time that fraud goes undetected decreased to about 12 months. So again, we cannot safeguard against our individual situation, but nice, strong internal control system can minimize the opportunity for fraud. And I believe that, but Alison, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I can spend a few more minutes, and I have separate slides for some key elements for internal control system. So would it be okay if I?
Absolutely. Yep, go ahead. While Mirae pulls it up, I think one of the things that's interesting to me in the data about the importance of internal controls, and why I'd love to hear a little bit more about it from you, Mirae, since we have a little extra time, is in our recent trust report, we people who said that they did not trust nonprofits did cite perceptions of scandal, waste, fraud, and abuse. And the problem was this wasn't just a single case where they said this is one bad actor. They said, well, this is why I don't trust any nonprofit organization. So what could we be doing, Mirae, to help make this a little more, our practices a little more rigorous so that we can protect the trust that people have in our organizations?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you raised that question, and I would love for us to spend a little more time during discussion about this topic. But one thing that I want to highlight is if you look at the records of the fraud cases, that's actually a very tiny portion of the entire sector. But those tiny bad actors are highly featured in the media that spread out more stories about those cases, and that create the images of the whole sector. So that is one of the reasons why earlier I said it. When one fraud happens, it damages not only just one individual nonprofit's reputation, but it damages the entire sector's reputation because one case that make the whole sector look similar. So yeah, I'm again happy to come back to what the sector can do about how the sector can safeguard against those damaging the images of the entire sector. But here are some extra slides that I prepared in case that we have sufficient time. So one of the key elements in internal control system, you can make sure that there is in the organization is to create clear audit trail process. That means there should be a mechanism to trace each transaction in a system back to its very source. If there are more spending than budgeted, there must be a clear way to go back to all the transaction to explain why there were extra spending to justify that spending more is not wrong. It just needs to be fully explained, and that's what audit trail means. And one of the most common internal control system element is separation of functions, which I'm sure that you have heard multiple times during your career. So the basic idea is no one should be responsible for our financial transaction from very beginning to the end. And individuals are always much less likely to commit financial fraud against their organization if they work in teams. In fraud cases, the commonly found story is there's a perpetrator who happened to be the very trusted person within the organization because the person managed the organization finance for like 10, 20 years, while other staff position had turnovers. If a financial director of an organization has been in the position for 10 years, it doesn't mean that the cases happen, but those situations create the opportunities, and that needs to be that there should be extra check and balance system. An example of separation duties is the policy that requires the person who logs in the check received in the mail is not the same individual who's responsible for depositing checks. And similarly, the person should not both prepare payroll and distribute and have custody of all the payroll checks. And there should be a periodic review by an objective person of the list of all vendors receiving checks from the nonprofit, because the common scheme found in the fraud cases is involving having created a fake vendor. The system of separation is also an effective system that helps the organization catch an unintended mistake made by individual. So some of the controls some of the controls that can be made to reduce the fraud detection time is job rotation or mandatory vacation. Employees who commit fraud tend to need to continuously work in that same position in order to conceal their fraud. So therefore, the job rotation or mandatory vacation can create the chance to have the fraud detected that goes undetected. So yeah, that when employees forced to perform another job or take vacation, that makes the chance for the organization to review the process. This is just a summary page if you want to have the list of what needs to be done for separation of duties. And another control item is to clarify authorization requirement for the spending process. What is to stop one of them from buying first-class air ticket and charge the organization for higher fare? Nonprofits can accomplish this by creating formal authorization mechanisms. Internal control system rely heavily on standard operating procedures. In other words, doing by the work, which might sound a bit rigid, can be effective to reduce errors. An organization can spend less time correcting errors if more time was spent upfront to follow the standard procedure. But that also means the manuals, procedures must be reviewed and updated regularly. The audit trail that I mentioned earlier requires the ability to provide all the detailed documentation. And in the current world, that documentation can simply mean keeping our electronic files well organized. But that also means there should be plan for lost electronic data or what, and thinking about what would be the consequence of potential damage to electronic data. In addition, nonprofits must have fidelity insurance that can allow them to recover from the losses of financial fraud. And fidelity insurance can be also a nice signal that the nonprofit takes good care of their accounts and is required to, and that makes them to keep good records of all their financial transactions. Finally, are these internal control systems are good to have in the first place, but it's also important to have an independent check of all the activities and have the activities regularly reviewed and the control system to be updated regularly. And it's also helpful to hire outside independent auditor to review their control system and have them offer suggestions, because outsiders are more likely to find flaws than insiders. So these are some slides that I prepared in case we had extra time to spare. So
thank you, Mirae. This is really helpful. So we're going to pause. This is the portion where we get to talk about what we just heard for a few minutes before we move on to talking about the overhead starvation cycle. So everyone, I just want to remind you, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. And we'll try to see if Mirae can answer any additional questions. You gave us a lot to think about. So while people are maybe thinking of their questions, I have one to pose to you, which is a couple of years ago, St. Petersburg Times, a newspaper, did a story where they basically kind of cataloged every instance of financial fraud and abuse that happened by looking at 990s where they were reported. The tenor of their reporting was, look how terrible this nonprofit is. And I think, I'm curious how you would respond to this, but there was sort of this question of like, the existence of fraud doesn't even necessarily mean that the organization itself is bad. So I guess how could some of the practices that you just walked through help prevent fraud or abuse, but also maybe help an organization sort of preserve its reputation a little bit, to say like, look, it happens in every industry, but here's all the mechanisms we have in place to try to make sure this won't happen going forward. So how could we also use these mechanisms as a preventative measure, but also to reassure, I guess, the public that like we are trying our best and this wasn't something that you should have to worry about regularly from our organization, even if it happens one time?
I mean, that's a great question. And in this, there is this study that is being currently done. There are only preliminary findings, so I'm a little bit cautious about to say, but the preliminary finding provides some support that when looking at the fraud cases, there are two outcomes in the end. So there's one outcome that suffered from the damaged reputation and the financial losses, and that ultimately close their door and just disappear from the world. And then there are another cases that create they create the opportunity for them to revamp their control system and the way that the organization is structured, and the organization continues to thrive only after a few years of bump because they had to survive from their damaged reputation. But those years give them a chance to restructure their organization. And the ones that actually survived after 5 years, they tend to actually continue to do well. And again, that earlier I mentioned like 25% close the door, but that means that the rest of 75% continue to operate. And also what you said earlier is perfectly right. Just because one organization had fraud, that does not mean that the organization itself has an issue. Like really well-managed organization can happen to have a fraud just because there's one person who actively thought the opportunity to create a fraud. Again, there should be a full perfect combination matched. And what I'm saying is internal control system can minimize the opportunities, but the 10-80-10 rule says there are always those 10% of population who would still make opportunity for themselves, but for the majority that we can minimize the opportunity. But there shouldn't be the same assumption for the fraud case, like made committed by one individual, is same as one bad organization, like with a bad financial management. But the whole issue that's amplified is how it's featured by the media. And it's an easy food for the media to consume because it creates more attention. It grabs more attention when there's a nonprofit that's supposed to do something good for the community commit fraud.
Yeah. And just for people to know, there's a new reporter at the New York Times, and he's put out a call for story ideas about the sector, but he's really looking for wrongdoing stories. Like that's how it was framed. It wasn't the touchy-feely stories. He's really looking to highlight what's going wrong in the sector. So it makes for interesting stories that people would read. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to pause for a minute and see if anybody, I have two. So I have plenty to ask, but I want to make sure there's nobody on the call who would like to pose.
And just because we were on the topic of the media, I want to mention that the next time that you watch the movies or just regular television dramas, just think about how nonprofits are always featured in the media. Like it's whenever nonprofit is featured in the movies or the popular drama like TV shows, the way they are featured is it's a place for people who are retired or who not incompetent. Like I want to like later I can find the source, and then I would be happy to share the source of this study. But there was some, like there was one my colleague who's at the CUNY at the University of city of New York, he looked at all different TV shows and catalog how nonprofit professionals are featured in the media. And the way the media portrayed is they are less competent, they are less ethical, and it's a place for people who want to take it easy. And it's the way the media continue to portray the image of the nonprofit sector despite the reality. And that's another thing that the sector should think about, how media portrays this sector, not just the fraud cases, but the entire great work the sector is currently doing. And it's only the people working in the nonprofit sector that can correct the media who wanna find this sexy story to grab attention.
Good point. I'm thinking about a lot of like Hallmark movies where the people who are nonprofit professionals, it's always their secondary career that they fall back. It's not, it was when it was like, well, I want to slow down. I want to take it a little easier in life, have a good quality of life. So I'm going to leave my really aggressive, high powered, stressful job and work at a nonprofit. And I'm not sure our staff would agree that that is actually what they will be getting if they move into a sector position. I will hold my question, a question till later if we have time after the overhead starvation cycle. But so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mirae, and I want to hear a little bit more about how the way we as a sector do talk about our finances influences perception, both between nonprofits and with the public, because it feels like that might relate to how the media thinks about us and how the public thinks about us too.
Sorry, I was just pulling up the slides, but so I will continue with the slide. Okay, yeah. So this is the second part of the sector trust issue, the nonprofit accountability issue. Then as I talk about how we build the sector trust, I'd like to bring the overhead myth issue. And I talked about this topic with Alison before, and we both agree that this is something that the sector has already enough talk about, and why does it matter? And let me explain why it matters. It's an issue closely related to sector trust building, because it not only causes the sector to be not trusted with its overinflated program spending ratio or artificially lowered overhead cost, but the very issue actually comes from the expectation for more accountability from the nonprofit sector. Most of you on this call are already familiar with the overhead myth campaign that has been going on for nearly a decade now, but there is still a need to have more wide understanding for the underlying issue to really address this myth. So this is a study that has examined the 20 years of declining overhead ratio trends based on the 990 tax return record. Again, if you want to read more about it, I put the source and the link here. But this is one graph coming out from the study that I wanted to highlight. As you can see, the overhead ratio wasn't always reported low. That in the 80s, that the overhead expense ratio used to hover around 20% until the 1990s, when there were major nonprofit financial fraud that disturbed the public and donors, like United Way having suffered a scandal involving its longtime CEO Armoni. And since then, the donors start demanding a measure that they could use, but we all know that nonprofit performance outcomes are so hard to objectively measure, and overhead ratio is an easily accessible tool, also because since the 1990s, all the financial record became available online. So just creating this measure became so easily accessible, and it's just easy to compare across organization despite its limitation. And with the starvation cycle, the ratio has come down all the way to around 10%. So what is the starvation cycle? So that's explained by Gregory and Howard in this paper. And again, for the full paper, you can read if you like, but I just want to highlight the idea of the starvation cycle. So this cycle explains that there are general expectations toward low overhead nonprofits, and those expectation pressures individual organization to either really lower their overhead cost at the expense of administrative infrastructure, or they report artificially lowered numbers by doing the cost allocation in the way that make them to produce more favorable overhead ratio. And the lower numbers reported out continue to create more expectation from funders, because it makes funders now believe that, okay, keeping low overhead is actually feasible for our, if our organization are doing, why do they alternate their expectation? And then the cycle continues and makes the whole sector starves from administrative infrastructure. So this cycle explains why it's not up to one individual conscious ethical organization to break the cycle, but it's a whole sector issue, because even if one individual organization realizes it's a miss, they want to report the real cost, then the organization just become the victim of the whole cycle. And you might wonder, you might raise the question that the graph that you showed earlier ended at 2010, and how things have improved or changed with the overhead miss campaign. So that's the curiosity I had. So I ran 2 survey experiments with nonprofit executive directors across the country, with my colleagues, and we also did some interviews with a different group of nonprofit executive directors to understand what's going on at this point. So this study is currently under review. So I didn't put the link to the actual study, but if anyone's interested in reading more details, I'm happy to send you a copy. I will not bore you with how experiment was done, but just to share the main findings. So the major finding in this study was that most nonprofit leaders don't trust high efficiency ratio like 98% program spending to be fully true. So the research suggests that the practice of deflating overhead spending or conversely inflating program spending is actually quite widespread activities. And additional finding that we had was the nonprofit leaders, executive directors whose nonprofits are having financial deficit, they were relatively more likely believe that 98% program spending is true when they see that another organization reported that number. What that suggests is a serious behavior issue. That means that when organizations are financially strained, the way that they continue is they cut all the administrative spending and they starve their selves and continue to survive with cutting the administrative infrastructure. But why that's a problematic behavior is that if they don't build infrastructure, their operation will continue to produce deficit, and then they will never get out of that financial deficit. So so there should be a behavior change, but it's not again up to just one individual organization to break the cycle. The second experiment and part of this whole project is to look at the overhead ratio gaming behavior more directly to see what's the level of gaming done for overhead reporting. So the technique that I put in the slide is the latest survey experiment technique that will probably make only researchers exciting. So again, I'm gonna skip the design of the part, but I'm just gonna go to the main finding. What were the finding of the study? So that's the finding of the study shows that the artificially reported overhead ratio is around 10%. What it suggests is that there seems to be the 10% overhead ratio that's ideally accepted in the field. So this one can be skipped. And then the last part of the study involved asking directly nonprofit executive directors. So these the nonprofit executive directors were different group from the ones that participated in the experiment. And we asked why the sector seemed to have the issue of artificially lowering overhead ratio, real or perceived pressure from donors, funders were the main issue, followed by the challenges with the individual organizations' financial management capacity. But also there seemed to be still problem with the general misunderstanding of overhead cost, what that means. And despite the fact that the overhead miss campaign was led by credit rating sites, but executive directors who were interviewed still mentioned that there is the role that they are playing to continue to pressure individual organizations to report lower overhead ratios. Many of you would resonate with the quotes that says funders unrealistically want all of their funds to go directly to the mission, without understanding that there are maintenance costs and there's a cost to support the administration. I'm happy to share more quotes if you like, but before I do, I would love to hear what you are think about the underlying issues to this overhead trust issue. And more importantly, I would love to have us to spend some time to discuss how we as a sector can break the starvation cycle, because I highly doubt any just one highly ethical, conscious organization can break the cycle. It's not really up to one individual organization to realize the overhead cost is missed. And also it's not up to just one donor to understand, but there should be the sector-wise intervention to break the cycle. So before we have some time to discuss, I just would like to thank you all for listening and contact information for questions.
Mirae, thank you so much. This was really helpful. Now, again, I would love to hear from some of the participants on this webinar about thoughts and regarding the questions you raised, right? Because here's the problem, the overhead myth and the overhead starvation cycle. You're right. It's been something we've been talking about for years. And some of the early recommendations were, well, nonprofits should just stop reporting overhead because it perpetuates, this misperception, that it's something that is a meaningful measure at all for our work and our impact. And B, it leads to a challenge in terms of like competition among nonprofits as to what a good ratio is. We've already established that there kind of is no such thing. It really varies by field and organization. What I think is really interesting about your research is it just reinforces for those of us like independent sector and other sort of sector-facing organizations how difficult it is to extricate your organization from that conversation. I mean, I think where you said like, look, the nonprofits report feeling external pressure to report it, period, from donors, from funders, from the general public. And because all of their peers are reporting 10% overhead as if it's achievable, they don't feel like they can report, 40% overhead. So there's sort of this race to the bottom to a certain extent due to environmental pressures, I guess is how I would
yeah, I think that environmental pressure is like really the perfect way to capture. I mean, like individual organizations understand that overhead is missed, but when it comes to actual reporting, if they report the real cost, then what happened is because others are artificially lowering the number that are reported, that make them at disadvantage when they go to the funding market. And although funders are supposedly more understanding of the overhead myths at this point, but when there are same applications and there are most of other organizations report lower overhead cost, there isn't a reason why the ones that's reporting the real cost would have advantage or at the competitive edge. So it gives them at a disadvantage. And again, that's why that it's not really up to just one individual organization. And I love that the question that I just saw, that the wording itself comes with negative connotation. And right, that might be one of the way that how the sector can address the issue. But at the same time, the sector, I mean, personally, I think that there should be more understanding of this cyclic issue rather than itself is an issue. That because the cycle that it pressures individual organizations to really minimize their spending or forces some organization to reallocate their cost in the reporting to have their overhead ratio to come around 10%. And when everybody's doing that practice, it continues to create the environmental pressure. And it wouldn't really solve the issue by making individual organizations or donors, funders realize that overhead is not the best measure, because that is still continuously still reported, and 990 forms still does have that portion breakdown between program spending and administrative spending. And also that's still part of the candid report that everybody can easily access and see. So it's not up to really individual actors, but if there are more wide understanding about the whole cyclic issue, I think that can be another way that we can start addressing the problem. And I know that it's not the perfect solution, but I would think that that would be the first step to start addressing the issue.
Absolutely. I mean, Krista, thank you for submitting that. And I encourage anybody else who has thoughts in addition to questions, please do, because this isn't an easy, I mean, we've been as a sector working on this for years. But the thing that really resonates with me, Mirae, with that question is overhead probably has a negative connotation because we've borrowed that term from business. And in business, there is an incentive to trim overhead as much as possible to maximize profits. But that's not how we work. So we're borrowing a term that intuitively is supposed to be trimmed as much as humanly possible to achieve an outcome that we're not even trying to achieve. So maybe we do need some rebranding, because it also is sort of misrepresenting what investments in our work get us, right? So you trim overhead to meet an outcome of maximizing profits in a for-profit world, but in the nonprofit world, you trim overhead, you're not scaling impact. And that is supposed to be our goal. Maybe we do need to think about another way of talking about it, because maybe the term is too loaded because people assume they know what it means, right? I mean, to your point, Mirae, about assuming nonprofit work is easy, assuming it doesn't require a lot of professionalization, and they assume overhead is always not great, and you should always look for opportunities to cut it. And all of these assumptions are not accurate. We could try to reclaim the term overhead, but that may be a fight, like a losing battle, and maybe we just call it program support costs or impact support.
Impact support costs, program
like
support costs.
I think that's really interesting.
Right, because always the name comes with some meanings, and when it's called overhead, that seems like a wasteful way of spending some money. And maybe today I'm a little bit obsessed with how the media portrays the sector, but that's another thing that I want to point out is whenever there's a natural disaster, you can easily find some reporters saying American Red Cross is is not spending most of their donations to program support. That's I like it almost became my habit at some point, like that, tracking the reporters Twitter that mention those, and you'd be surprised, there are still many reporters who come up with the overhead cost over overhead ratio, how much of the donation go to program directly during the time that where more attention should be spent, how American Red Cross is actually helping people during the disaster. But when there are more stories covered about how their donation go directly to helping people, there is no understanding of there are administrative support who would need to reallocate resource or arrange how the help can be distributed. And I'm sometimes shocked that even in 2020, 2021, 2022, I continuously see those articles coming out. And that perpetuate the image of overhead in the nonprofit sector is a bad thing.
We have some work to do ahead of us. I have a couple of other questions for you, Mirae, but I want to pause and ask participants, and maybe just wait a moment and pause uncomfortably to see if anybody feels brave enough to speak up. But other ideas, either about potential ways to sort of break up beyond this conversation that we've been having, because I think, Mirae, that your data is showing all the talking that we've been doing and sort of like internally within the sector isn't really making a lot of headway, right? That nonprofit individual organizations and leaders still feel pressure to live up to the norms that currently exist, and we're not changing the narrative enough. So if anybody has ideas on how to reorient our norms, or if you have questions that maybe we need to answer before we even get to the solutions phase, like what else might we need to understand before we're ready to create a new intervention and maybe turn the curve on this?
I mean, while waiting for questions come up, just the thing I learned from my experiment was that there's an elephant in the room that no one's talking about. That this, because my experiment participants were nonprofit executive directors, and when they were given anonymity, so our experiment setup minimized the social desirability bias, meaning that it does minimize the opportunity for them to give the answer that's more desirable, like look more honest. So that the results show that all these executive directors do know that other peer nonprofits are not reporting the true cost of the overhead, or let's say program support cost. That there is some perception, like the perception among the in the field that we are spend a little bit more, but then when it comes to reporting, like around 10% is perfect measure to be put out in the report. And that's the elephant in the room that no one's talking about. And I think recognizing the issue and making it more publicly acknowledged can be a way for people to start talking about, okay, we are all doing, let's not do it. And let's go back to the way it was in the 80s when there was no pressure and when organizations were reporting the way it was.
I mean, I think one of the things you said, you designed your research to control for the fact that people will often give you the answers they think you want to hear, not the true answers. I think that highlights a problem maybe that we're running up against with conversations in the sector about this issue, is that the sector isn't really able to have an honest conversation about this because organizations worry about the reputational damage that might come from a public conversation on the topic, right? that's something that's really challenging. I do want to make sure I pause. Let's see. Robert had a comment. It says current accounting standards require a functional statement reporting where M&G fundraising categories are reported. That information comes from an audit and then reported in the 990. The requirements need to change first, I think. Yeah, and I think that's what we need to sort of identify. What are the pressures on nonprofit managers that make it feel like they need to continue to report this information? And that's where, if we have a more accurate diagnosis of where those pressures are, that's where organizations like IS and you said sort of the charity rating sites, where we need to take action, because individual organizations don't feel free enough to advocate for this themselves, or at least by themselves, right? They need some cover, which I think is really insightful. So thank you, Mirae, for a really thought-provoking set of research and data. It's not necessarily something we didn't know, but it really provides texture and nuance to things we intuitively understood, but now we can point to it and say, I know this, and Dr. Kim has data that actually backs up what I knew from my history and expertise in the sector, right? So it's always great to be validated by research. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me today.
I want to make sure we are going to put a link into the chat for this webinar. We want to make sure we're designing events that are informative to you, and we want to learn from every event that we put on. So please feel free to take the link or visit the link to take the survey. And then I also want to invite everyone to join Independent Sector for our second Upswell pop-up of the year on June 21st. This event will focus on tools to strengthen your bridge building skills and tackle challenges around building a healthy and racially just nation. So, and I think that link might also appear in the chat in just a moment. Thank you all for your time. The biggest thank you to Dr. Kim. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for attending the session.
Thank you all.